Hello friends, ArtsyMommas here. This tutorial we will be doing a flat shape using a cookie cutter. So we'll be needle felting just a flat shape with a cookie cutter, and this is a great first project for beginners. I have another video. If you haven't checked it out yet, you might want to look at that first. It explains the basic tools you need, which you can see here: pads, needles, wool. Talks a little bit about that. And it also talks a little bit how to handle the needle and how felting actually works. So check out that video first if you have not, and if you're just starting out. And we will get started on our first project. You can see I have all the things I need here. The wool, okay. I have my pad. I have my cookie cutter, little squirrel here today. And then I have some examples of what we're doing. These are flat shapes, as you can see, that I used cookie cutters to make. So we're going to start with this little squirrel friend. And the first thing we do is we want to make sure our pad is big enough for a cookie cutter shape. You can use any sort of cookie cutter shape. I have different ones. This is an older one, but I like it. You can use plastic ones. I think these are oftentimes for Play-Doh, but I don't recommend them because you can see that it has this ridge on the outside. We really want something that is just straight through, no ridges or bumps. That's going to be something to catch your needle on if you have any of those shapes. So try to just find a real pretty basic shape. You don't want a lot of fine little details that you need to felt either at first. It's a little hard. So you can see this one, it has these thinner arms. And this one turned out well because I do have a little more experience with it. But it can be difficult to try to get these small spaces felted enough. So when you're starting out, just a really basic shape, I really recommend something like this heart is the easiest, or a butterfly, something really simple. This squirrel will work well for us today. So what we're going to do, we're going to have our shape here. We're going to use our needle. I recommended for beginners this larger gauge needle. It's probably like a 30 gauge needle. It's a heavier sort of build too. Some of them are more petite. This one's nice and chunky. This is a good starting out one too because you have plenty to hold. It's not going to break too easily when we use it. They do tend to break sometimes, especially when you're starting out. So that's normal. Don't be too sad if you break a needle, but do have a few in case that happens. So this is a nice starting out needle. It's probably like a 30 or 32 gauge, and it's nice and sturdy. And then we're going to take some batting. We talked about the batting in the first tutorial. So I'm going to use this kind of dune color. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to break off. There's a lot of wool here that comes in my packet. So I'm just going to break off bits at a time. And if you don't know this about wool, you'll find that if you try to tear it, like if you get your fingers really close and just try to tear it, it's not going to happen very easily. The wool has its own lengths of the fibers there. And if you just take the ends of any chunk and pull the ends, it'll break naturally where it wants to. So that's a tip of anytime you're separating wool, to just do it easily and naturally from using the ends of it to pull it this way. Okay. So I'm going to start with smaller chunks. I'm not going to wad them up. I noticed that when I do workshops, a lot of people want to wad it up and shove it in there. We don't want to do that. We want all this wool to kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. So we don't want it in chunks. We want it a little more fluffy. So even this piece that's pretty fluffy already, I'm going to do a little bit of spreading, especially the ends, because when I lay another piece on top of that, I want those two edges to integrate and overlap. I don't want them to be two edges forced together. I want them to have some nice overlap. Okay. So we're going to fluff this out a bit, and then we're going to push that. I'm going to start up here in the tail. So I'm just going to kind of push it in there to get it started. And then you can see I'm going to need some other pieces. So Again, I'm going to kind of separate these ends so that they can overlap. That one was a bit of a flat edge, so I could fluff that, or I can just figure that flat edge is going to go over here against the metal and not against the wool I already have. So if I'm overlapping wool, I want those to be more fluffy. And this side, I can just tuck that straighter edge into there. So you see now we have this filled in and this filled in, and it looks like I need a little piece there. So I'm going to start off with a smaller piece, tuck that in there. Okay. So now I've got it covered, but I want it to be a little thicker. And again, these can be different thicknesses. So you can see this Christmas tree is a lot thinner than this heart. And that's just because I used more wool in this one than I did in this one. So that's, again, just a preference, but it's nice to have something kind of substantial. It's a little easier to work with. So again, I'm going to kind of fluff those edges. I'm going to tuck this again up in here. Make sure I get it pushed up into the tail. I don't want that end of his tail to be really thin. I want to try to have a uniform thickness across this cookie cutter. I can always add more wool because you'll notice that some areas will just be thinner than others, and we can add wool later. But if we start with a good base, we'll be better off in the long run. So then this last piece will go down there. And I think I'm ready to start felting. So remember, we want to felt straight up and down. We don't want to wrench our needle back and forth when we hit it into the pad. It could break. We also remember only this area here at the end is doing the work. This area has barbs. None of the rest of the needle does. There's no reason to shove your needle deeply into the pad. It really only needs to go through the wool and into the top of the pad. So don't worry about stabbing it very hard. And we don't have to go fast. If you get better and you like going quicker, that's fine. But slow and steady works very well. And don't forget that this is very sharp. So the cookie cutter is nice for a starting project because you're less likely to stab yourself since your hands are usually staying outside here. And we also want to be careful not to hit the cookie cutter. I mean, it will happen sometimes, but that could break our needle. So we do want to be careful. So what I like to do is trace around basically the edge of the shape. You can see I'm just kind of going high enough to where I can grab some of that wool, but then I'm just tucking it inside the cutter and going along the edge just to get that shape started. Okay, and I'm not going fast, not rushing. I'm just getting it all along the edge. I could move my hand as I need to just get that basic shape put in there. Okay, so all the way along the edge, and then I could go through and poke down the middle. And you can see we're starting to get a squirrel shape. And we talked a little bit before how people often ask, how do I know when I'm done? And as I said, that's a preference. The different shapes I've done, like this one is pretty firm. That's because I felted it many, many, many times, so it gets it really nice and firm. This one, even though it's thicker, it's a kind of a little more softer, a little more squishier because I felted it less. So really how much you felt it just determines how sort of dense the final product's going to be. And that's a preference. Some people kind of like the wispiness of a felt project that hasn't been felted too much. It feels a little more soft, a little more kind of homemade. And then when it's denser, it just has a different texture and has a little more detail, a little crisp edge. So that's just a preference. So we're going to stab, stab, stab all inside here until I can look in there and I can see the parts that haven't been felted as much and the parts that have. You want it just to be, like I said, nice and uniform across the entire surface. And be sure to get these edges, that's really a part that you want to work on well if you want to have nice, clearly defined edges. We can go into it later after the shape is complete, and we can felt from the side to make those edges a little crisper. But the work you do now to kind of follow along there will keep your shape when you take it out of the cutter, because we will need to pull this out and turn it over, because when you felt, it will stick into the pad. It's a synthetic material, so wool doesn't like to stick as much to synthetics, but it will stick some because we are driving it into the fibers of the pad. So we will have to take a little break, which I'll show you. Just let me get this a little bit. If you pull it out too soon, you'll lose your shape entirely, and it'll be a little frustrating to put back together. But I think we can lift up our cutter. So you can see the shape here is pretty defined, but when I pick it up, it's going to lose some of that shape because I'm kind of pulling it off this base. And you can see how it's real fuzzy here because we've poked those fibers down into the pad. But that's okay. That's a part of this process. So then we flip our little cutter over, and then we flip our piece of wool over and we tuck it back in there. And now we're going to felt the other side. And that's just a way to keep it from getting stuck into your pad, but also to kind of get both sides felted so that one side's not firm and the other side's got all these fluffy bits. So we're going to do the same thing that we did before. I'm going to walk the needle around the edges. Get those filled in. And then go through the center and get those filled in. And this is essentially how we're going to create our base. So it could be a solid shape that we don't add any detail to, or it could be something that we decide to go into and add some details later. Like I added these little ornaments. This one, I kind of made it look like a little cookie. I added some frosting on top. So those are optional. The squirrel here, I could leave him as just a solid color. If I wanted him to be a little more simplistic, a little more decorative. Or we could add a little eye or little kind of details to where maybe his tail would be. We could put some dark in his tail. We could do things like that when we're done, and I'll show you how to do that when we get to that point. But there's just a lot of variation and flexibility in needle felting that I really, really enjoy. So you can see we've gone around and tucked most of those fibers back in that were sticking up before. And so guess what? We're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to flip it over. We're going to lift off the cutter and we're going to flip it over. And you're going to do that several times, definitely until you get the shape holding up well. And then after that, like we said, until you feel like it's as dense as you want it to be. It's your personal preference. So see, now we got the fuzzies on this side. So we're going to flip it back over. Oops. And we're going to felt from that side. And you can do that anywhere from 3 to 6 or more times. And if I wanted to even make him even thicker, I could add more wool on top of this if I felt like it was too thin and I want it to be thicker. Felting I like because it is very sculptural. You can add almost like clay. You can add more to it. We could even, if we just for some reason hated the way his tail looked, we could actually just tear that right off. You can add and take away from wool almost like you do if you're building with clay. So that's really nice. So I'm happy with the thickness that I'm at. So I'm going to, again, just trace around the edges, felt him down, And I'm going to do that maybe 2 more times, flipping. Because I do, like I said, I like mine pretty dense. So I'm going to work away at that. And then I'll get back to you to show you how we can do the sides to get those sides kind of firmed up and how we can add a few details. Okay, so I think I'm happy. I flipped it probably about 5 times back and forth. And so I have a squirrel shape. You can see it's pretty loose on the edges here. And we will work on getting those a little fixed up now. So we're still going to go with our up and down motion like I taught you before to use. And but we are going to hold this now. So you do need to be careful because we're going to be poking into something that we're just holding. So do be careful, go really slow. So essentially all I'm doing is going along these edges here. And instead of felting this way into my squirrel, I just want to felt straight down into those edges so they won't be quite as fuzzy. And again, we're holding it, so be careful. Just work your way very slowly across and kind of move your hands up as you need to. But we just want to work on that edge of the squirrel to tuck in some of those loose bits of fuzz. And we're gonna, then I rotated it. You can see I'm just gonna poke down this way, and I could look at the shape of the squirrel here so that I can remember, like, this is his little foot. I just want to poke straight down. It's kind of squares off there. Then I'm going to come over the top, poke that down. Again, I can feel my fingers there, so I'm just going really slow so that if I do, bump my finger, I'm not stabbing it into my finger. Because as I said, this is very sharp. If you're going fast and you poke your finger, it will bleed. Okay, so just gentle. We're going to come up his body here, up his tummy. We're going to just carefully, and you can keep your fingers pretty far back so you don't stab them. We're just going to poke those edges. We're just making a little bit of a cleaner line. And see, I'm kind of spreading my fingers there so they're not even in the way. And do that when I can so that I don't poke myself. And I'm just going to come along this edge. Move my fingers again. Come up along here. And then that looks like he's kind of got a little hand there by his face, it looks like. Or a little acorn, I'm not sure. It's got a little bump out there. So I'm going to define that bump here. Poking in there a little bit more. If I poke in a little deeper, you can see how it kind of pulls that in. So I want to make sure my fingers aren't there. But I can poke in a little deeper to make that a little more of a defined edge there where his little foot is. And I'm going to do that, I think, at the bottom down here too, where the bottom of that foot's supposed to be. So I'm just going to poke in a little deeper to make that defined there. So I don't know if you can see that, but I made that a little more defined just by poking more on those kind of edges there, those little creases. And then we're going to come up here and do his face. So again, slow and steady so you don't poke your fingers. You're going to come up over his little nose. The nose there. We're going to poke down here along the head. Right there. See? And then we're going to, again, make it a little more defined, how his ears come up. So I can poke in a little deeper there. And that's just dragging those loose fibers in to the piece. And, remember, we're only using this part to felt, but if I poke it in farther, I can be felting sort of down in here and making this a little more pushed in. So I can get some decent detail with even a coarse needle like this. Okay, we're going to go up along the ear, around the edge there, gently. I can feel it kind of getting close and poking my fingers, but if I'm going slow, it's not going to stab my fingers. Just going to go very slow around that ear. I actually look like I'm making his ear a little less square, which I like better. So you have some room to kind of do your own thing in there too. Okay, and then I want to kind of make that crease again behind his ear there. On this spot, poke in a little deeper there to make that crease defined. Then we're going to go down his back. See, down there. Oops, poke myself a little bit, but no blood. It's good. Go. You can do this laying it down too, I realize, like if that's easy for you on the mat. I'm used to holding my projects. But you can lay it down, but you won't get probably as much of these loose fibers tucked in if you do it that way. But if you find that you are having a hard time holding it and not poking yourself, you can definitely lay it down. And I remember we said I did preach about the up and down movement. And now we're going to the side, but I hope you realize we're not stabbing into the pad and wrenching it up. We're only stabbing into the piece. So we're still going straight up and down to perpendicular to the actual surface there. See? Okay. So along the back, and then again his tail. I want to have that little defined, so I'm going to stab a little deeper in that area. And that gives him that crevice, that little joint there. And then we'll go along the tail. We're almost done. I'll probably time lapse a lot of these. So don't try to go as fast as I do when I'm in time lapse. Okay, almost done. Get along the top of that tail. Just to tuck that in. And then down the back. There we go. Okay, down to his base of his tail there. And again, I'll poke in a little farther there to make that little crevice a little more defined there between his tail and his little back of his thigh. Okay, I'll go down that thigh, down to his foot. And again, I'll go a little deeper there at his little heel. So we get that bend. And back to where we started. So you can see that gives it just a little more definition on those edges. They're still kind of fuzzy, so you could go around again and do that again if you wanted to. You could even felt some, if you find like this looks a little lumpier sort of on the surface there than you'd like, you can certainly gently felt that down. You don't, again, want to go too far because you don't want to make these fibers any fuzzier on the back. See that every time you go through, right, it's dragging those fibers down. So you can just gently felt some of that down to make it more even. You can do any little fine tuning here you want. This is the part, like I said, it's done when you think it's done. If you're the type who really likes to go in and get it very evened out, you should do that. If you don't, I think this looks nice, kind of lumpy and bumpy. Like I said, it's got that real kind of homemade feel to it when it's like that. But that is our basic shape. Okay, and also remember that I'm always sticking my needle here when I'm not using it. Just get in the habit of doing that. I call that our felting etiquette. It just helps you not to lose any needles, not for them to end up on the floor and anyone step on them. That would not be fun. So if we want to do some details now, maybe say I want to make a funny, cartoony type eye. So I have some white, or actually this is just undyed, of the batting I showed you in the first video. So I'm just going to take a little piece. This is probably more than I need. I'm going to make a pretty big eye. It's funny to see like how little wool you actually need. But this is quite a decent sized chunk, but I kind of want to make a funny and cartoony eye. So I'm going to kind of roll it up. I know last time we did not roll it up, But this time we are, because we want it to be a shape, a circle. We don't want it kind of just flowing into the other one. We want it to be a defined edge. So I'm going to roll it up in my fingers like that. And then I'm going to find kind of where I want his eye to be. I think right there would be fun. And then I'm going to sort of stick that in. I'm going to hold this carefully out of the way, but with my finger there, while I gently poke a few times. I like to say that our needle is almost like glue. It's like I'm gluing that eye on there. So wherever I want that glue to be is kind of where I'd put my needle. So I can get it stuck on there. I could still pull it back off at this point. I was saying how it is very sculptural and that you can add or subtract. I could add more white if I wanted even a bigger eye. But I'm happy with that. So I got it kind of glued on. So I'm going to start going around the edges here to make it a little more round. Because I want that eye to be round, like an eye is. So I'll just use my needle to shape that. See, and I'm just poking it sometimes a little farther. Like I said, if you want a defined edge, you can go do a little bit of a deeper poke than you would normally do, just to generally felt like we did with the body. Because I want this edge, see how it's making a lot more clearly defined. And then I can go in and kind of even this out. And then do those little details. It's going to be a pretty funny eye because it's pretty low, I realize now. I'm doing this upside down so that you can all see it. So it comes out a little funny for me. But say that's his funny little eye there. And then if I want a little pupil, I'm going to need another color. And again, I'm going to roll that up like we did before. Just roll it up. And I'm going to find where I want to put this one. And I'm going to poke it in there like I did before. So I kind of roughly hold it and poke like I'm gluing. So he's going to have kind of a funny cartoon eye. This little guy. So see, I'm just stabbing that. And then I can go along that edge again and go a little deeper because I'm trying to define that edge. And then I can go back in up here and even that out. Just making little stabs. And keep in mind, we're working with a pretty coarse gauge needle. We've used the same needle for the whole time. If you have other needles, if you have bought like a set, I mentioned before, there's different gauges. They range from 30s to 40s. This is one I use a lot. It's one of the, I think it's a 40, and it's thinner. It's kind of hard to see so far away. But this works great for kind of roughing it in. But if you have a finer gauge needle, that would work a lot better. So see how you can feel the difference. Like once you switch to a finer, it pokes in a lot easier. When you're using these heavy gauges, they still work, but they'll make a hole. I don't know if you can see that. You can almost see like a dent where it poked. And again, it works, but you're just not able to get as much detail if you switch up to a finer gauge. Okay. So that gives us a funny little goofy eye for our little squirrel. And you could add any detail. You could add some different colors in the tail. You could even do like a pattern. And the great thing about needle felting is that you could even sew into it. So you could, if you like to embroider, you could stitch a design. You can add a little loop, like this is a Christmas ornament, and I just put a embroidery floss and just sewed it through the top and tied it up to make it like an ornament. You can add a little clasp to the back to make a hairpin, like a hair clip. You can make a little brooch. You could really do almost anything with these shapes. So I think we'll wrap it up there. That's just a basic flat shape with needle felting using a cookie cutter. And that's a good project to start on. And so the next one would be doing some three-dimensional forms. So when you actually kind of sculpt and build a three-dimensional figure, which is the tutorial I think I'll do next. So be sure to like and subscribe and check out my Etsy shop. The link's in the description. And have fun.